Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back for another review. Today I'll be talking about the Denon AH-D9200. This is Denon's current flagship model, coming in at a price of $1,600. This headphone is probably one of the best, if not the best, closed-back headphone on the market today, and one that I think is talked much too little about in that context as a flagship headphone. It comes packaged in a cardboard box which has a plastic insert with some synthetic silk-like material, providing for a very photogenic presentation when you open the box. And at the bottom of the box you have a cardboard box including the cables and accessories, as well as documentation for the headphone. Now, the headphone itself is built extremely well. It's made out of a frame of cast solid aluminium, cups that are made of bamboo with the inlaid metal pieces spelling out Denon's name, and the headband is made out of genuine leather that is quilted on the inside and nicely padded, and the pads themselves are made from a very high quality protein leather that is near as makes no difference like real leather, though I suspect it won't last quite as long, and if you do need to replace them they are very expensive. But that is as it may be. The headphone itself runs with a biodynamic driver, as we've seen in Denon's past models, similar to Fostex's models, since Fostex used to produce all of Denon's headphones. I'm unaware if they still do in this case, since it is still a biodynamic driver, though the ones in these headphones are somewhat different from what you see on Fostex's models, in that these have a free edge design, which Denon postulates is more similar to how a speaker driver performs in a full-size loudspeaker. Whether that's the case I can't say, and how it affects performance, don't know, but they definitely sound good, I can say that much. They, in terms of sound tonally, they land somewhere in between Denon's past models and Fostex's current models, and something like an AH-D800, a more reference-like headphone. Denon's past models and Fostex's biodynamic drivers are known for a fun sound, a more V-shaped sound. The AH-D9200 strives to reach a more reference type of sound that is less V-shaped. It has about 5 dB less bass than the Fostex TH900 at around 60 Hz, but consequently at the same time that is still 5 dB more than most of the classically reference-tuned headphones like the AH-D800. Which is at about 0 and then rolls off as you go further down, whereas this remains at about 5 dB above 0. When you go into the treble area, these, much like other biodynamic drivers, tend to have a peak at around 5.5 kHz, same as Fostex's models, though these have a very minute bit less of that peak than Fostex's models do. And when you move further past that, they have much less peakiness than you see on for example, the AH-D800, which is known for having a sort of bright peak that people are annoyed by. In this case, these have a substantial amount less in that area. They simply have that slight peak at 5.5 kHz. That serves to accentuate timbre and transient response. It makes bass notes hit with more pronounced snap and make leading edges on notes more clear. Whether you call this a trick or an actual, technical skill of the headphone, that is up to you, how you look at frequency response. The bass itself is somewhat pronounced, but in the overall, I'd say this headphone hits the mark of being a very reference or neutral sounding headphone. And they do indeed, as a result of being very neutral, work with pretty much all genres. Though it has to be said, if you listen to music like Sturgill Simpson's music, which is intentionally mastered and mixed in such a way that it sounds similar to very retro recordings, almost have a radio style compression to it that gives it a very shrill, almost harsh, noisy quality to it, these will make that very evident, though I wouldn't say they do it more so than should be expected. That is a trait of the recording, and these translate that trait very clearly. they don't hide it in a way that some darker or more rolled off headphones might do. For example, an Odyssey headphone will tend to, in that same 5.5 area, have more of a recess, which will make such qualities slightly less evident and slightly less grating, but at the same time I would argue that is not an accurate presentation. Now, when we go into actual individual parts of the sound of these, bass, like I said, is very punchy. It's not as full sounding as full-blooded Fostex models are, but it still has a very good punch because of that elevation that it does have, that shelf at 5 dB, and is transient-wise supported by that slight treble peak. The bass is somewhat dry, very snappy, very controlled. It's not at all bloated, though it does seem to have some quality of supporting the mid-range, which is overall very neutral in terms of measurement. However, it has a more full-bodied sound to it than you find on a headphone that doesn't have that lower-end shelf like the AH-D9200 doesn't, or the Biodynamic T1. On these, the mid-range gets more body. Male vocals particularly get more weight behind them, and instrument notes tend to as well. The mid-range also exhibits a sort of intensity to it that I think is a side effect of the closed-back nature of this headphone, which keeps the soundstage relatively close to you, and all sounds are relatively compacted in a sort of wall near you. They don't go out of your head in the same way that an open headphone might. These tend to stay more close to you. That can be a benefit or a negative depending on what you prefer. If you want orchestral music to stay far away, classical music, for example, can benefit from a sound signature where you're more so observing details happening at a longer range and with greater dynamic separation, then these are not ideal, though I'd argue for closed-back headphones they do a very admirable job and probably one of the best on the market. But that is simply a quality that is very difficult to reproduce in a closed-back headphone in my experience. What these do instead is give you a more visceral close-up experience where that dynamic difference, I'd say arguably, is somewhat less than you find in open headphones, but that lends the mid-range to have a quality where textures are presented very, very accentuated and very clear. They have I would almost call it grainy, but not quite, but it does force out detail in those notes that wouldn't be there on headphones that have that more distanced presentation. That I think also relates to the treble, which doesn't really draw attention to itself generally speaking, at least not once you get used to it. If you go from a dark headphone to this, it might have a sort of somewhat bright signature to it, though I won't say that it's not nearly as V-shaped as past Fostex models, but it does accentuate details using that treble, but it is not. It doesn't really get on your nerves, I'd say. Again, I haven't really found any genre or any particular things that this headphone does not work with, which again I think it's one of its great strengths, is being a very good all-rounder. So I think that's all more or less the frequency areas. Now, to take some examples where I see these things play out, if we take a track like The Garden, that is from a German band, this has a very pronounced deep string instrument that starts right from the beginning and is then further in the track supported by, there's a synthesizer thing going on in the background and a male vocal that comes in with some background violins going on. But mostly these are string instruments that are bowed, and you can very clearly tell on this more so than I'd say on for example the AH-D9200 or the T1 or some of the other headphones I tried, including Fostex. These make the texture of those bowed instruments much more clear, and because of that accentuation in the low end, it never seems to overstep. It never becomes something that draws attention to itself in the low end, but it does add more weight and more strength to the ambience that very deep, dark note of the bowed instrument is creating. In a sense, it gives the sensation of a well-integrated subwoofer. It doesn't draw attention to itself, but if you turned it off, you'd be quite upset. As you find when you hear the same track on a headphone that does not have this slight shelf, suddenly those instruments have nowhere near the same ambience and are sort of drawn back to the point where they don't really call attention to themselves in the same way. They aren't as integral a part of the track anymore. Now, if you move to something more modern, there is a particular synth pop-like track that I listen to, where this starts to show some of the really known strengths of the biodynamic driver. They have a very, very nice, with the synthesized bass kicks, they have a very nice punch to them. And they overall present that track very well, though the synthesizer can pick up a slight, I won't say harshness, but you can tell that it's a synthetic sound. But I think that's, in all honesty, a quality of this headphone. It doesn't really come off as, in other genres, as something that's an issue. And I won't say it's an issue here either. It just makes it very evident what you're listening to in a way, but without getting quite as much of... It's not like on for example, the German headphones, where it becomes a problem with some genres. Some genres don't work on those headphones without EQ, arguably. On this, they all work. It's just presented very clearly what's in the music. And I think that also becomes clear once you take something less synthetic, like a track called The Void, which is a dark jazz track, which is very well recorded, where this exhibits a very clear ability to pick out each instrument and place it. It's not placed at a great distance. They're all kept relatively intimate, but you're still very clearly able to say where is each instrument placed and what is the actual timbral quality of that instrument. It has an exceptional ability to show off texture in each instrument, more so than showing off differences in distance. It can show off difference in distance, but it's not as exaggerated as you might find with an open back headphone. But the sound staging is overall, the imaging is very good. The sound staging is good, but it's not big. It keeps in your head, but the imaging that goes on with the instruments in this track is very clear. And the overall ambience of the track is very well communicated. I think that's also something that lends itself with this mid-range quality of a sort of compression-like quality. Is one place where it was very clear why it can be a very good thing was with a track by Billie Eilish, where on her entire album she has very, very closely mic'd vocals, and you can really tell that with this headphone. This headphone really communicates very well the sensation of someone singing right next to you, right next to your ear, which in this case was next to the microphone. That's a less clear experience with open back headphones that I've used to compare it to. But going on to genres like metal, for example, if you take Faluya or A Pale Horse Named Death, Faluya Abandon, Pale Horse Named Death is another band that... Both those bands have a very large quantity of information in their tracks. One through a very grungy, very noisy sound, the other one through a sheer amount of speed and actual information, musical information happening. And this headphone does an excellent job, especially compared to the Fostexes I compared it to. It does a very excellent job at actually keeping up with all that information and picking it apart, allowing you to tell what's going on. And at the same time, it lends itself much better to this genre than open back headphones that I tried, because of that more intimate presentation, but combined with the reference quality to its sound, that makes a very powerful, very visceral sort of wall of sound effect with metal. But at the same time, without losing detail, something like an Odyssey tends to create a wall of sound, but it's all very mushy. Here, it's still very, very clear what's going on, to the point where it almost gets an almost grainy quality to it. But I'd argue that is in part innate to the noise that is in this music. And its ability to communicate that in a way is essentially just testament to its detail retrieval, although I'd say it's not quite as great a level of detail retrieval as the AH-D800, but it does a very good job, particularly for a closed back headphone. Lastly, a track by Danny Deluxe called Star Eater. This has a very large ambient sort of reverberating synthetic synth retro sort of sound going on that pulses with a very powerful bass. And this headphone sort of shows here that it has the power to deliver that, but without going overboard in the way that, for example, my Fostex TH600 does. The TH600 gives you a very powerful sort of rolling wave type of experience with a pulsing bass that is sort of almost rubber-like bouncing, but it's slightly not bloated, but it overdoes it very slightly, and that is very fun. But at the same time, when you use this headphone, you can tell very clearly it has that more dry quality, a slightly more refined quality, where you can really tell what's going on, and it does its job in making a powerful bass hit, but doesn't overstep from there. It simply gives you exactly what the music demanded and then stops. And I think that they hit the nail on the head with that, with this headphone, because it goes from being just a fun headphone to being something that you can actually use with all genres, right from electronic, where it has the hard hit, to metal, where it creates the visual experience, to jazz and classical, where it can do the placement of the instruments and the textures in a very interesting and pleasing way. Its only real shortcoming, and I wouldn't even say it's a shortcoming, would be that slight compressed sense that comes from its closed back nature, where it can't create quite as big a difference between each instrument. But again, I think that's sort of given in the actual physical character of what it is. So overall, to me, having heard most closed back headphones short of ZMF, I'd say these are up there, some of the best, because they have very good all-round sound, and they have a very good timbre that is usually innate to the biodynamic drivers. It doesn't have the metallic quality that you find with, for example, Focal's headphones, which is one of the major points of contention you see when you look online and see what do people think of these two compared to each other. I usually see people fall one or the other side based on whether or not they want that extra bit of clarity and detail that the Focal Stellia might provide, but at the cost of a slight metallic timbre, which this doesn't have. This has a more natural tone to it. But yeah, that is overall my opinion on this headphone. I'd very strongly recommend that anyone looking for a closed back headphone take a look at it, particularly because it's so well built, and it is actually not that big. It's not as big as Fostex's models. It's slightly smaller, to the point where it actually works fine as a portable headphone. I would have loved to see it come with a case, rather than attempting a fancy packaging. This is a case where I'd rather see something like Odyssey, where they just ship you a cardboard box and then put the headphone in a very high quality carry case. Though I suspect in this case it's sort of in the nature of the brand to want their flagship to look fancy once you unpack it. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions regarding this headphone, or any of my listening tests I did with it, or any other hi-fi related questions, feel free to ask in the comment section, and I'll do my best to respond. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for watching.